Good afternoon. Today is the 26th of October in 2011. I'm Darrell Peterson, a volunteer at the Palm Springs Air Museum here in Palm Springs, California. As part of the Veterans History Project of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., we conduct interviews of veterans and civilians who have participated in our country's military conflicts, especially World War II. Today we have the honor and privilege of interviewing two men who were civilians in Europe during and after World War II, and we'll be asking them to share some of their experiences that I'm sure is unique to many people in the United States. So we'd like to get, their names are Ojars Kalns and Andrew Stabens, and they were lived in Latvia during World War II. They now live in Canada. So let us get started with the interview here. If you would tell us your name and where and when you were.
Hello, my name is Ojars Kalns. I was born in June the 5th, 1932, in a small town, Alūksne, northeast corner of Latvia, Baltic states. My family and I lived
Go ahead.
in the town until 1944, and as the Russian front was approaching us, we were forced to flee because my father was originally in the Latvian army and would be very good candidates for a trip to Siberia one way. We walked across.
Let me introduce your friend here, and then we'll go back and go into more detail. So you introduce yourself.
My name is Andrew Stabens. I was born in Riga, Latvia, capital of Latvia, in January 20th, 1938. I left, my parents fled Latvia for the same reasons because of the Russian invasion, re-invasion of Latvia. We left Riga around 1st of October 1944 and wound up eventually in Austria, some 30 or 40 kilometers away from Salzburg until the end of the war, and then after that we wound up in the refugee camp for 5 years, and then we were able to immigrate to Canada in 1949.
Okay. All right. Well, now let's go back to you, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about the country. I guess you were old enough to remember things before the war started. You're still
Yes,
pretty young.
Latvia was basically agricultural country. I think the numbers were about 120,000 individual farms, about a mixed farms.
So how many people lived there?
In the late 30s, Latvia had around 2 million people. There was some fair percentage of other nationalities. As I recall, we even had an Estonian high school in our town.
Oh.
And German mix, there was some Russian mix, some Polish, some Lithuanians. The cities were mostly Latvians.
So do you know anything about your ancestors, or did they live in that same area for many years that you know about? Or
I never met my grandfathers because one of them died when my father was 14 years old, and the other grandfather was killed on the Lithuanian-Polish border around 1917.
So that was part of World War One, as
That
you
was,
call it.
yes, it was, I think it was in the 25-year man.
Okay. Well, how did you, you were in school, I guess, or?
Yes, we started public school for 4 or 5 years. For 1 year that we had to learn, when the Russians were in the country, we had to learn Russian, of course. When the Germans came after, and in 41, 42, up to 44, we had to learn.
So what year did the Russians come into the country?
First time they came into Latvia was 1940. And
So this was before the Germans went into Poland, or
well, this was
after, I guess, it was
yes.
39.
But there's obviously there was some kind of a mutual agreement. I think it was the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement of August the 23rd that divided Europe. And when the war started in 39, when Germany invaded Poland, Russia, of course, came into the Baltic states. That was part of their secret agreement, which the Russians, of course, denied for a long time.
Okay.
The Latvians didn't have a big enough army to resist the Russians, who already had the border was too long. And
So they just basically came in and
They just-
took
yes.
over. Was this a
Yes.
bloody
Well,
coup of the government
no, it wasn't.
officials, or they
no,
just?
no, it wasn't. It was. I think it was agreed that we will be treated fair, and that we'll be able to carry on with our lives as before, which of course didn't happen. A year later, on June the 14th, in 41, the Russians deported some 15,000 people, families, many officers of the army, families, children.
And civic leaders and anybody in leadership, is that kind of what they were taking out of the country, or
They just
was this
herded them
random?
into cattle cars and sent them away.
Where did they go?
They were sent to Siberia.
So this was for slave labor camps, or
yes,
just?
history records that at the time of the Second World War, Russia had close to 20 million slaves in Siberia. When there's a city, just to give you an example, there's a city called Norilsk, way up north, that's built on about 12,000 Latvian officer graves. It's an industrial town.
Yeah.
But they were all the way down to the far end of the.
So what happened to you and your family? Others were shipped away, but you were not?
No, we escaped, and in 44 we escaped to Germany on a relief boat. My father was transferred into what was called to build fortifications throughout eastern part of it.
Okay, for the Germans?
For the
Right,
Germans,
yeah,
yes.
okay. So,
And so
and
that
for
we-
between, there were several years there, did you just continue going to school from?
Yes.
and-
Up till
but you were
44 summer, we left our home in July of 1944.
Okay,
It took us 3 months to walk across the country, which was only about 250 miles from east to west,
wow.
and then took a boat.
And this was, how many in your family, or what your
There was
group?
my father, mother, my brother, who was a year older, and my grandmother,
So
5 of us.
did you just on foot, or did you have
I was mostly on foot, but
so everything?
we had one horse.
Okay, so you had some
Helped
way
us.
of carrying a
Helped
little
us.
bit of stuff, huh?
Yes.
Yeah. So how did the Russians treat you in the school before you left then? They
We
took
didn't-
over all the teaching
No,
positions?
we never joined the Red Star Club, which they wanted us. But basic because I was only about 10 years old at that time.
Yeah, yeah. But your family was probably under some pressure.
Well, family was, and of course, you know, when the 1941 deportation time was, well, many of my friends were deported.
Hmm.
So there was no.
What did your father do? Was he a farmer or what?
No, my father was in the Latvian army.
Oh, he was a.
Yes.
Was he an officer or just a?
He was a staff sergeant and I guess you can call it the reconnaissance.
Okay. Yeah,
He spent, but he was. We were separated in October when we landed in Germany, and he was sent to to help build the fortifications, and we never saw him from November 44 till May of 1945.
Hmm.
That time we spent on a farm just north of Berlin.
So how did the Germans, how did they treat you?
Well,
did they know where you were coming from, or?
We were treated fair, but we were still Ausländers. Well, I guess the term was verfluchte Ausländer.
Which I don't
I
understand.
remember that one.
Okay.
But
Again, you probably, you didn't go to school, they probably put
no,
you
not
to work.
not for that year. They were no. I don't think it was possible really for us to. We didn't have the language skills,
Yeah.
which were not that hard to.
Is there any similarity between Latvian and German? There's like English.
Latvian is a
and
very old
German.
Sanskrit language.
So you had to pick up a lot of
We pick
new
up
words.
the words. Yes, that was no problem.
And did you continue to stay with your mother, brother, and grandmother?
Yes, well,
Kept it?
after the war was over, we ended up on the wrong side of Elbe River. And we had to get across because the borderline became the curtain, Iron Curtain line was the Elbe River. So we had to go across, and we ended up in the northern part of Germany in an old Hansa town called Lübeck.
Okay, and
Well-
there was still the four of you all together? or-
5 of us, yes.
5,
Yes,
okay.
yes.
All right, well, at least you
Yes.
got to
Father
stay together.
joined us towards the end of April. He came to us.
So this was part of West Germany. I'm not that familiar with the map.
It became eventually part of Eastern Germany,
Okay.
the Elbe River. But,
So did you get out before it became East Germany?
when we learned that the Russians are going to come and take over where we lived, and obviously by that time there was already some transportation available for us to get out. And
Was there mass exodus or?
yes,
Everybody
certainly
wanted
for refugees,
Yeah,
because they were scattered all across the countryside with the German people.
but the Germans that were Germans stayed where they were pretty much, or did they try to?
They stayed.
Yeah,
To my knowledge, most of them stayed.
they had no idea what was coming.
They did, but, and I don't know what happened to the farmer, because for one, the farmer that we were stayed, he had 4 daughters. What happened to them, I don't know.
It was unbelievable turmoil to go through all that.
Well, it was difficult, in particular when the following years, we really didn't know what's going to happen to us. We were, the Russians sent their so-called agents or emissaries in to encourage us to return to Latvia. And they couldn't understand why we didn't agree with them.
Yeah. Did anybody go?
Very few.
Yeah, well, that's
I
good.
recall of one family who had 2 small children. The mother learned that her father was lost in the war, and she decided to return. But the issue with the refugees, Baltic refugees, was an interesting one. That we learned later on that it ended up eventually. The issue was ended up on General Eisenhower's desk.
And what?
Who had told the Russians that to leave the Baltic refugees alone.
Oh, okay. And did they obey that, I guess?
They left us alone.
Okay. So how did the, I'll call them West Germans, you were on the side that wasn't going to be communist, the Allied side. Did they treat you pretty well then, or?
Well, we lived in separate camps. We were totally, which were before the war, were built for the army, German army.
Okay.
So we were under the United Nations Relief Organization, which later became the International IRO, the International Refugee Organization. They were the ones who were looking after this. And
So
of course,
was there a plan developed on how, in the long run, what was going to happen
not
to
until not until 47. Britain was the first one who would accept single people to go and work in the coal mines and everything. Canada was started to accept them in 48, particularly family men, as my father and my wife's father both came as farm helps. You had to sign a year's document for $45 a month. That was your ticket to Canada.
Okay.
Then they would bring the family, but they knew that the fathers are going to stay on the farm.
Yeah.
So you had to do 6 months labor and have money in the bank and show where you're going to live, and then
Yeah,
they would
that's
bring the wives over.
Indentured
contract,
service,
actually.
they call that, I
Yeah.
guess. That's the way
And then there were others. There were some lumberjacks, the sort of actions. Then there were gold miners. There were railroad workers. These were groups of people that would be accepted in the Canadian labor force. Women would be household helps, basically.
So, going back a little bit, what in Germany, what were these camps? Tell us about the living conditions there. Was it?
Well, there was a shortage of food, so we.
So did you have tents or barracks or?
Well, there were barracks there, and we lived in a section of town that were originally officers' family quarters, but every room had a family in it, and there were no kitchen. The kitchen had a person in its stay. There was the food was brought in from a central kitchen.
Oh. Okay. So
And
was it fairly reasonable or not?
barely
Yeah,
reasonable.
Not too good. Not too.
But there was always chance of going to buy some additional food, whether it was to go to the fishing towns and to supplement. But it was scarce.
Yeah. So did they allow you to
We had the freedom.
work? Could you get a job if you found someone that needed some?
Didn't
your
look for a
skill?
job because
It was.
the jobs were very scarce,
Yeah.
other than whatever the camp needed. And the numbers weren't really.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what in Canada then? What skill did you have that they allowed you to come over to Canada? It's,
Well, I was 16 when I
oh,
arrived in
okay,
Canada.
all right. So, but
And,
your mother
I-
then, or who?
And we had my mother and my grandmother. The five of us all eventually on 4 different occasions arrived in Canada.
Okay.
And we finished, my brother and I finished high school. And my father started to work on construction and mother worked in a
Okay,
factory.
so did you basically come over under your father's skills then? You were family, or?
Laborers, just as
Okay.
simple laborers.
And what city did you go to in Canada then?
A small town called Brampton, which is just outside of Toronto, Ontario.
Okay.
And that was where the farming community, there was about 15 families that came together, and they all ended up for the first few years when we got out of the farm. I worked myself on the farm for 3 months, and then I decided when I was 17 to go to work on construction.
Okay. Yeah, well, that's a good job.
Yes, it was. Instead of $35 a month that they paid me, I started to make 60 and 80 cents an hour.
Hey, it was big money back then. dollar an hour
Oh,
was that was a premium wage back
Yeah.
then. So, okay, let me. So you're in Canada. Let me catch up with your buddy here and listen to his story, and then we'll talk about Canada a little bit more when we get him to Canada. So you want to tell us about you're a little bit younger. So,
Yeah, yes.
what do you remember of the war?
What do I remember the war? I guess the first thing I remember was when I was 3 years old. I have a recollection that I was lying in the woods beside my mother,
Ooh.
and there was somebody else lying beside us with a bunch of large bullets and probably a bandolier around them.
Hmm.
And I was told to be quiet and keep sleeping because my grandfather lived outside of Riga, and when the Russians were retreating in 41 and the German army was moving in, the smart thing was to everybody to clear out and get into the bush, into the woods, because you don't know who was going to shoot you.
Hmm.
So that's sort of my first recollection of the war.
Well, tell us a little bit about your family then. Do you have mother, father, sisters,
Yeah.
brothers?
No, I don't have any brothers or sisters. My father was born in I would call it, I guess, a rural area near Valka, which is near the Estonian border. And my mother was born in Latvia, slightly towards the west, and they met in Riga. My father basically was my paternal grandfather had 2 kids, a daughter and a son, and the farm wasn't big enough to support both of them, so she stayed home, and my father went out to work, so he wound up in the capital, Riga. Eventually, he became a carpenter or some sort of a foreman in one of the theaters, building sets and doing carpentry
Oh.
around there. So basically, he would be what you call nowadays a journeyman carpenter.
Mm-hmm.
My mother worked, she had gone to a commercial high school for a couple of years, so she worked in an office until I was born, and then I understand she was kind of at home looking after me since, when the war started in 40 and 41. I don't think she was working at that time.
So, what kind of, did you live in an apartment or you have a house? Or what
We lived
kind
in an
of-
apartment. We actually lived in an apartment across the road from the factory where my mother had worked.
Oh,
It
well,
was
that's
the,
convenient.
the government electrical factory, the big electrical factory in the country. I guess their biggest international credit was the Minox camera at that time.
Yes.
They had invented the Minox camera, which was
The
a miniature
Minox
camera.
Hmm.
So,
Well, what was the form of government, I guess, before all the invasions? I'm not familiar with.
Latvia was, it was originally part of the Russian Empire, and as a result of the First World War turmoil, they declared independence in 1918, and they were a democracy. Well, some people say it was a democracy till the Russians came in 40, but we did have what I call a dictator took over in 1936, but it was a bloodless coup. Nobody got killed. A few people got thrown in jail for a few months, and the dictator took over, and he was sort of a benevolent dictator. People still fondly remember him as the good guy.
Yeah.
Didn't go and shoot anybody or conquer anybody or steal any money. And then when the Russians came in 1940, then they basically occupied the country, and allegedly the Latvian government asked to become one of the republics of the Soviet Union, which still is an issue.
Sounds suspicious.
Yeah, which still is an issue with the Russian population, because the Russian population of Latvia, by their leaders, are told not to admit that it was an occupation under force, that it was voluntary, and that the Russians were good people. So, in 1941, the Germans invaded, and then they were in charge till 44, parts of it till 45, till the end of the war.
So the Germans and the Russians were fighting in Latvia, were there any battle lines through there?
Some
or was-
fighting. I think the 41, from what I read in the history, was more so like a run through Latvia, except in a place called Liepaja or Libau, the German name on the Baltic coast. The Russians held out for about a week, which was very unusual in that sweep when they went through there. But basically the Russian army collapsed without any major battle in the first couple of months, till they swept right through, I think, parts of Estonia and what's now Belarus, and I'm not sure when they ground to a halt till about September, I think. But they stayed there till 44, I think. In October they took after October the capital was lost, and then there was still what they call the Kurland pocket that stayed open. The German
They
forces.
held back, I think, to something like 1 to 10 odds. The number of Russian divisions that were tied up in Kurland.
Yeah, Kurland
And
pocket.
some historians venture to guess that had those forces been released that were tied up in that Kurland pocket, that the meeting grounds in Germany would have been much further west.
Hmm.
There were large numbers of Russians that were
Yeah.
tied up.
So the reunion might never have taken place because they would all
Well,
have been in Russia or Soviet Union, I guess.
Yes, but of course, who knows, where the Americans and the Russians met, where I was in Germany, about 15 kilometers into a tributary to the Elbe River.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't know who's going to get to us first,
Yeah.
but it could have been a different line of demarcation, the meeting line.
Yeah. It's,
Because, you
little,
know,
little things
we
make
all
a
know
big
what-
difference sometimes.
yeah, we all know, and some of us never could still understand why the Russians were given back the land that the Americans won.
Mm.
But that's another matter.
I could see that might be a little bit of a discussion.
Yes.
That's why-
But they were trapped, some were trapped, the refugees who got trapped, who couldn't get out second time.
Yeah. So, how did you fare, or what was the path you took to get to Canada?
Well, we were in the same thing. We were in the refugee camp from
The same?
same period of time. It would have been the fall of '45, and again, I think Ojars had the dates right roughly when the IRO took over, because the plan was, this was, I think, also in conjunction with the Marshall Plan in Europe. It was also to resettle the refugees, and the IRO took over, and I think they were supposed to resettle the refugees by about 1951. And in our case, we were, the immigration actually was not just to Canada, but you could apply to Australia, Argentina, Chile, Venezuela, but for some reason not to the United States. Actually, they were the last ones to take refugees in from the IRO. And then from what I understand from the people that didn't settle, didn't emigrate, some remained back in Germany, and have carried on. But we lived in an old former German army camp that was probably built either early in the war or before the war, which was next to an older army camp that was an American Army base. So Ojars said his father had a hard time getting work. My father, being a carpenter, got work up in the base because they always needed something done up there. So I can't think of the name of the camp, but it's referred to as Camp Glasenbach, but it was named after somebody. And the only thing I remember interesting about that camp, when I read later on, this is actually where Audie Murphy got his Medal of Honor
Is
after
that
the
right?
war presented to him.
Wow.
And apparently Eisenhower had visited, but it wasn't a big base. So from internet research, I understand there was some medical unit in the base, basically. But we never got to see it because it had the nice big two-story cement buildings, and we were into the little wooden barracks that you had to heat each room and so on.
So, was your mother and father and you? You said you didn't have any brothers or sisters?
That's right. It was just the three of us.
Okay, so you were able to
Yeah, we were able to stay together. Yeah. I think one of the fortunate things, again, you look at this in retrospect, is my father was 36 years old at the critical time. And what happened was the Germans were actually drafting people in Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania into their own forces, and forming. Actually, they're putting them into SS divisions, which sounds pretty ominous. But the thing is, they couldn't put them in the regular armed forces because they weren't German citizens. And if you weren't drafted in there, then you might get drafted into some sort of a work units, or you were going to be drafted into some other duties. So he was 1 year too old to be caught in the draft. And when we wound up in Austria while the war was on, and again, I'm sort of going back, reconstructing, is people like him were a valuable commodity because all the young men and all the people were away in the armed forces. So we wound up in the village in Austria, working for the what I guess was the party bigwig in the village or in the town. We had a lumber yard, and he was happy to get my father because he had a healthy man, 36 or 37 years old, who could work in the lumber yard, and there was nobody else around. So they put us in the house, and an old house right by the lumber mill, and my father worked in the lumber yard, and I just hung around.
No school for you?
No school for me.
Did you ever get to go to school? Or?
Well, we had school at DP camp, and then this is where we started learning English and stuff like that.
Okay. So, but that was not really structured.
No, we were, and, you know, in a way it was kind of an interesting time. We were kids, and you kind of knew there was a war going on, and you could see the planes coming over, and I even remember the Americans arriving down there, and my mother thought, gee, they're just a bunch of young kids, you know, they don't look like they're seasoned soldiers, not like those Germans, you know.
Yeah.
And they did
Right. A lot of them were 18, 19 years
Yeah,
old.
yeah. You sort of envision of being sort of,
See, by the time we were 12, I was 12 years old, I had seen 4 armies, starting with Latvian, then Russian, then German, then American, and plus English.
Different army.
Because we were in the English zone.
So you
See,
have
the occupied Germany was divided into Russian, English, British, American, and French.
Mhm.
Now, if you were a Latvian in the French zone, particularly a man of age, you were given a choice. You either joined the Foreign Legion, or else you get sent back to Latvia.
Oh.
oh yeah, the French zone.
There wasn't much of a choice, but there were a few that got into, and actually there were quite a few Latvians that ended up in the Foreign Legion.
Yeah.
That's
Some of
right.
them came out
Yeah.
alive. They live in
I
Toronto.
remember talking to one of the guys who had an interesting experience, and he spent till 53 in the Foreign Legion because life in the French zone wasn't that good for a young guy.
Mm-hmm.
But we were interesting. We were basically under military government, I think, literally until the time we left. And the leader, as the saying goes, was General Mark Clark. I mean, I think, at the front down there, and everybody know he was a good guy, but he's the boss in charge of everything. You know, all
Mhm.
the good things in life come from the Americans, and General Clark is the big man up there. We never
Okay.
saw him, but you know, he was the great benefactor of us all. And we talk about food. We initially I think we ate surplus army rations because we had all kinds of green cans of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Bet you never want to see them again.
And, well, you know, when you're hungry, you'll take it. You know.
And there were always some apple trees over across the fence.
That's
Yeah,
good.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the good part with my father was, and a lot of us in camp, was that the base was up the hill, and they needed actually civilian workers, and there wasn't much among Austrians, but among the refugees there were all kinds of skills. And I remember my father coming home, and he said, you know, these things, there's a lot of weird things go on up in there. He said people can walk through a store pushing a little buggy and putting things in it, you know, like food.
Yeah. A shopping cart.
I
That
guess
is
they
something
must
new.
have had a shopping cart, like a supermarket type of commissary up in the army, in the camp.
Yeah.
But I still have a reference at home of his father. He got a reference from some first lieutenant that he was a good worker, because after a while, I guess they were going back home, and they cut back on the labor. So they let go a lot of the people in the base because they weren't needed, and the base was cut back. So then some of the people, because we're near a bigger city of Salzburg, some of the people could get in and make some money, working locally, because the country had to be rebuilt down there in Austria. So you kind of scrambled and made best of what you could.
So when did you or the family decide to go to Canada then?
Well, whenever the disposal started, they were probably they were already lined up to go in '47, and the real immigration from Austria started in '48, and the deal was with Canada. And I'm looking at my father's letters. As a matter of fact, I took stuff down here to edit because I'm translating some of
Oh,
them.
okay.
And it sound like initially he wasn't that excited about coming to Canada. Everybody was trying to get to the United States because it had a reputation of being, Canada, they weren't sure. They thought it might be kind of a pretty primitive place.
And it's a little colder.
So the way that it was divided, a bunch of
Well-
people that were sent over, I don't think they had a choice where they went. So the first group that went over wound up working on a hydro dam north of Lake Superior, and my father came over to the next group about 3 weeks later, and he got off the boat in Halifax, and they put the whole bunch of them in a railway car, a couple of railway cars, took them over to a place called Kapuskasing, and broke them up in 3 groups, and they actually pulled the railway car right into the plant. They didn't let them loose in town, fed them, and then they put them 45 miles into the bush into a lumber camp to cut pulpwood.
Mm.
I mean, it wasn't that you couldn't jump out the window and run, but the fact was you're in a strange country, you didn't know the language, so you all
Yeah.
stuck together. So if they want to take you 45 miles into the bush and put you in a camp with pretty primitive facilities to cut wood, you were lucky. Because I think, looking again at my parents' correspondence, the big fear was, this is in '48, when the Berlin airlift was going on, and the people had the feeling that the war could break out at any time. They had this feeling that the Russians were going to march, and
Yeah.
there were actually a few rumors, somebody let a couple rumors saying the war is starting at such and such a date. So people basically were thinking they want to get the heck out of there, no matter where they're going, whether it's Venezuela or Argentina.
Just to
or
get out
Chile.
of Europe.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
to get out of Europe, because Europe wasn't
Wow.
a good place to be. And they figured that, Americans were moving out, and we didn't know anything about the Brits because their zone was far away. The whole feeling was that if the Russians are going to move, nothing's going to stand in their way.
Yeah, then even British might become under Russian control. That's
Hard to say. Yeah. Well, I guess they were pretty beat up economically.
Yeah,
after
but
the war.
yeah, I suppose everybody is sick of the war and wanting to get out of the harm's way.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah.
Well, that's,
And there were, even I remember as a kid, we had the Russians come over and show us movies and try to tell us what a good life it is to come back.
yeah. So, okay,
Well, all total, I think there were about 200,000 that escaped from Latvia. And some of them ended up in Sweden.
oh,
Some of them stayed in Germany. Most of them immigrated to United States and Canada.
no,
And
South
the
America.
third- and Australia.
South America wasn't as attractive.
I-
Wasn't that many.
I think the ones to Argentina that we knew, they all got out of there because, number one, there was a change in government. I think Perón's government fell, and secondly, it was, some of them just barely got out of there because things were actually even worse in Europe to go to Argentina at that time,
Yeah.
economically.
I think all total about 150,000 stayed in this continent.
But there were some 10 rich Latvians from Venezuela who really felt that they thought the place was so disorganized. They went out, made a ton of money.
Well, there's always a few of them.
But the centers in the United States, I'm just trying to think by experience, a bunch of them wound up in Grand Rapids for some reason. I think it had something to do with furniture factories.
Oh, Michigan.
And then
Well,
Milwaukee.
Cleveland is a very popular place. Grand Rapids,
Milwaukee and
Because
Omaha.
of the
and,
car industry.
But New York was too big. Like I was saying, where they formed the groups, there was no sort of a Latvian house in New York of all places, but Milwaukee, Chicago, Grand Rapids, Omaha. Some of them were actually sent down to Mississippi to literally work in a plantation too, and they got the heck out of there as quickly as they can for colder climates. And
they're scattered.
like you said,
Still
they
scattered
say a
all
couple of
over.
your classmates wound up in
Well,
Korea
yes,
because
yeah.
they were drafted when they became old enough.
Yes,
Oh.
I'd be, if my parents had decided to go there, I'd probably be drafted. One of them they both retired. Actually, three of them. One was a perpetual sergeant. He's passed away. One who
Professional
got some
soldier.
action in Korea. He's still alive and lives somewhere outside of Chicago. And the third one was in the Marines and lives in New Hampshire now.
Hmm.
So they took a slightly different route.
Yeah. So let's see, you live in Vancouver?
Yes.
And you're in
I'm near Toronto, I'm in.
Toronto, so how do you two get together?
The wives are sisters.
Oh, okay.
Actually,
That's a
the
good
third
reason.
man that you met is
Third
married
sister.
the third sister.
Okay.
So this is our trip to Palm Springs. It's the
Family
second year
reunion,
now.
yeah.
Oh.
Family
Okay.
reunion, so that the sisters can do a little bit of bonding on their own.
Okay.
We just came to see what the war was
Okay,
for.
well, you probably never expected to be
Yeah.
on camera
Yes.
here, huh?
No.
But
But
since
you'll-
we did have a draft, but we had Canada had an interesting system which ran from the time of the First World War. The Army was basically reserves. Most of the generals that fought in Sicily with Canadian troops with the British were basically, I think, even up to brigadier level. They were guys who were part-time soldiers. So they used to have a cadet corps in each school. And,
Oh,
and,
like
you know,
ROTC, I guess we
yeah,
call it,
but
huh?
no, but this is in high school. You
Yeah,
you
well,
went
they
in,
have high
you went,
school.
yeah, you went into high school. I remember it was kind of interesting. You know, you've been in the country for 2 years, which in the cadets, and so we learned the British procedure, the parade procedure.
Oh, yeah.
They even got
Quite
us
formal.
formal, and they even, I think, I got to go to camp and get $100 for 53 for 7 weeks, and got to fire a Bren gun, and we worked on the radios, the 19 sets, which actually had Russian on them because they were making them for the Russian tanks. And
Oh.
the military was fun stuff, because they were going to run the armed forces the same way probably if the war was, and then the people in the cadets would want to join the reserves, and then they'd call up the reserves, and then we'd all go to war again. You know?
Hmm.
But they had an interesting system in Canada.
Yeah.
You know, the Lee Enfield rifle, you had to know backwards and strip down the machine gun. This is in high school, you know. And I was thinking now, you know, we were talking about the kids in other parts of the world going out there bombing other people. Here you are, you were 14 years old, 15 years old, and they're sort of training you with weapons that you
Mhm.
can kill, you know. And I
Yeah.
thought, it's kind of an interesting approach in a peaceful place like Canada. You
Yeah.
know?
Did you know that the first commandant in Berlin was a Latvian general?
No, I didn't.
Jan Berzic.
Oh, the Russian
Uh-huh.
commandant, yeah, he was from the old days.
And that the negotiations between the Americans and the Russians, were both translators were Latvians.
No, okay. Well, that's a claim to fame.
Jan Berzic, of course, was a very famous one.
Yeah.
He was, I think, next to Zhukov almost.
Bergeron, wasn't it? Berzic.
Jan Berzic, Jan Berzic.
Jan Berzic, yeah.
And now, of course, you'll find, you may still find a Russian general who is Latvian. And there's, I think, one or two generals, I think, in the American Army,
Hmm.
of Latvian descent.
Well, have you kept up with any family that stayed back there? Or did
We have
everybody
relatives
you
in
know?
Latvia now,
kinda-
and of course, many friends in the States.
Have you been back there now?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was just
Recently?
there- I was there in July.
Well,
Oh.
it's been okay for the last 21 years, you know.
Oh, yes.
Since.
Yes, they're
Gorbachev.
going through the problems with democratization.
Hmm.
Yes. When going back to the 30s, you see, when there weren't very many democracies behaving like democracies in Europe, period.
Yeah, kind of imitation.
Yes. And then Mussolini started the trend
Mm.
of dictators, and was followed by quite a few others. Franco was a long time man.
Yeah.
See, the military is kind of an interesting thing with, for instance, Latvia and some of the Baltics, because they were part of the Tsarist Russia, and they seem to be pretty liberal about letting people into their military schools and officers' schools. They had the same system as the Germans. You could go into high school, a military type of a high school. When you came out, you're something like, I wouldn't know if you're an officer candidate or a sergeant candidate, and then you could go to a military college and become an officer.
Mm-hmm.
So when First World War was over, or during that time, the Latvian military was basically formed by officers trained in the Tsarist army, and some of and these officers became actually the generals. So the training was from the Tsarist army into the Latvian army, and even when the Second World War started, when the Germans drafted the officers in, you wound up people who had been trained as very young in the Tsar's army, served in the Latvian army, and now they were put into the German army, like it or not. Like, they basically had a draft. They had a draft, and they drafted whatever officers they could get their hands on, and it was sort of like, I think up to age 45, or no, up to age 55 if you're, let's say, a lieutenant colonel rank, if they could find them. So then the Germans grabbed them. So it was kind of an interesting life, because you sort of had almost like a profession, a military profession, because these people had served various powers, but it was like a craft in effect. So
Must have been a real problem for them to decide where their allegiance really stood. Huh?
well, they had really
They
no
had to,
choice, but
yeah.
it was interesting. Reading up on it, because you've gone through this history, the tactics and the approach, and this is more like infantry, ground forces. If you knew the one system, you picked up the other system, because the Latvian officers didn't seem to have any problems in picking up the German methods and tactics and everything else. And when they went through training, there's accounts of them that they were able to actually, when they went into the tactical problems, give some nice new solutions, because all of the officers went into periodic training, and it was sort of, it's so like that time. I think there was like a military caste in effect.
Mhm.
If you'd been in the one army, and of course when the Russians came in, they also took the Latvian army and they put a bunch of them in what they call the Territorial Corps in 1940 and 41, and some of them who didn't get out basically got scooped up and they went into Russia and became part of the Soviet army. And they also put a bunch of Latvians into a Soviet division. And there was a situation that I think at least one time in Kurzem, the Soviet Latvian troops were facing actually the German Latvian troops at the same, on the different sides, and you had no choice. You just didn't throw up your arms and go to the other side, because the other side was a good solution.
Yeah.
If you as the Russian side went to the Germans, you're in trouble. If you're the German side, went to the Russians.
And
so
of course, now that the Russians claim that they liberated Latvia.
Of course.
Yes.
It's too bad.
Of course.
The old guys, I used to be able to talk to some of the old guys. They're all dead now, but boy, did they have interesting stories on that part of the world in their
I could
lives.
imagine.
Because they went through a different generation.
Yeah, something that's totally different than anything our country has experienced.
Well, you see, you had the draft, and I think at that time in Europe, everybody had the draft, because my father was drafted in 1927 or 28 when he was old enough, and it was 18 months, and I think I've still got his papers there. His specialty was gas warfare, because they were still thinking about gas.
Yeah, well, World War I, there was a lot of that.
And you were likely to be called up for the next 20 or 25 years. That was a thing. They drafted you, they gave you 18 months, and then you were on call. If there was an emergency or war, you came in with the little envelope and you gave it to the recruiting, and then the recruiter would open up and find out what your superior officer had written down that you could do, and then you would be put to work in the military.
Hang on just a second, I need to change this tape. I'll try and do it quickly here. Yeah, it's, come on.
think they'll be looking for us.
Yeah, maybe they thought they should have stopped by.
Now you're gonna have your own home movie here that you can entertain your wives with.
Some,
Subtitles.
Yeah.
or maybe introduced by a couple of dancing girls.
Yeah, let's hope this doesn't turn out. I had one interview with the Historical Society in Toronto, and I lived in an area that was sort of a poor area when we moved out there that became very, very trendy later on. And they found out that I'd been in the 50s in that area, and this lady so happily interviewed me. And the first statement she says to me, she says, "Tell us about all the famous people that lived down there that you knew." And I looked at her and I said, "When I lived there were no famous people down there. Everybody just went to work and school." She was so disappointed.
Well, yes, well, tell us a little bit about your lives in Canada since you got in there, and now there's been many years. What's been happening in the intervening years?
Well, our parents have long since
Yeah.
gone. They are all in the same York Cemetery, the place where we have reserved our place,
And where is that?
north of Toronto.
Oh, okay. So
Because-
everybody's
Yes, we
coming
thought
back
we'd
to that area.
stick together till the end.
And by
Yeah.
And after.
and by coincidence, I keep telling people, and Princess Olga, who's the sister of the last Tsar, is also buried.
Yes, there's some famous people.
Well, what profession did you go into?
I wound up as an engineer initially, and then I went to law school.
Wow, what kind of engineer, and where did you go to school and so on?
I went to University of Toronto, finished industrial engineering, worked for a couple of years, and I went to Osgood Hall Law School, which was the big law school in Canada, and then went out and practiced for a while. And I retired 4 years later, and I get to hang around with, my relatives.
Well, sounds like you've done all right, though.
Yeah.
And how about you? What did you?
Well, I finished high school in Brampton, and then in '56 decided to go west. Went to Vancouver, got married in '57,
And
started
where
school.
were your wives? Were they
They
in
were
one
all in
place?
Brampton. They were on a farm outside of Toronto.
Oh,
But the
okay.
homestead on which I reside.
Yes.
How convenient.
That's the home.
Nobody else wanted the place, so
had
I
our
wound up
weddings
with it.
there, and then I studied in McMaster Engineering for a year in '53, and then I went to UBC School of Architecture, graduated in '62,
Mhm.
which will be 50 years in another 6 months.
Wow. And so you
And,
were an architect then? Or
And then from '68, I had my own practice in Vancouver.
Designing commercial?
Designing mostly residential,
Oh,
high-rises, apartment buildings, the odd
Okay.
church.
well, that's
Was a mixed bag. It was up till about in the '90s. Then, with the advent of the computer, I thought that I'd have to join up with somebody to have the equipment and everything.
Mm-hmm. So did you do that, or
So no, I just phased out.
So did you do anything else then, or you
No,
just?
it's just take care of my rainforest in my backyard,
Oh my!
letting everything grow.
Oh, okay.
Have no lawn to mow.
Yeah.
And, wife, who was a teacher, she is retired now for a few years too. So
Mhm.
actually, all our
Well,
all three
tell us a
sisters
little
have
about
retired.
these ladies that you met.
Well,
were they all, or both, or all three of them school
Well, yeah.
teachers, or what were
Well,
they?
your wife was a
She
teacher
she
trained,
was a teacher, then she worked for me for a number of years.
Oh,
and the youngest sister was a nurse and graduated in Western Ontario.
so do you have
She's
children?
retired.
Do you have children?
I have 3 grandchildren.
How about real children, daughters and
No,
sons?
2. No, I have 3 children. Sorry, 2 grandchildren.
3 children and 2 grandchildren. Yeah.
But the oldest grandchild is 25,
Yeah,
and
I
he's 6
know.
foot, and he's 6'6".
There's so good vitamins in Canada.
Yes. And the other grandson is also 6'6",
My goodness.
23, but he's working at Atlanta, Georgia.
Oh. So, and how about your family?
Well, I've got 2. I've got a son and a daughter and 1 granddaughter.
Okay.
And that's about it.
Where do they live nearby?
Yeah,
They-
my daughter lives, I guess the next town, Burlington, maybe 25 miles away, but that's nothing. It's just like here, you go from one end of the valley to the
Yeah.
other. And my son lives in Toronto, and he went the same route as an engineer, and now he's a lawyer.
No. Like father, like son.
He wants to generate electricity, because we've got a lot of green power now coming up, and wind, water, you name it, whatever it
Yeah.
is, fertilizer.
That's
So
great.
we've done well. I
Yeah.
think from where we came and what our parents went through, that was.
Yeah, it's unimaginable to us the way we live nowadays to endure the conditions of being on the road for what did you say 3? How long does it take to go across Latvia there?
Well,
40 foot, 3 months.
About 3 months.
Yeah.
We rarely got to sit in the wagon. We usually walked.
Yeah.
Well,
I
we
don't-
got.
I don't know how many people nowadays in the U.S. could imagine that, much less do it.
We were, in a way, I really didn't realize how lucky we were, till I read up later. We got on a train, which was unusual, and we were the last train through in Prussia at Tilsit or Memel, and apparently the Russians came in about an hour later. And we were in Danzig for a while, and then wound up in Austria. And our baggage arrived 2 weeks later intact. And I was doing some reading. There was a book that came out last year about battleground Prussia, and it sort of confirmed what I understood happened with the Germans. The Germans themselves in Germany never admit that there was a problem. Life had to go on as it was,
Mhm.
and even the military that was stationed down there, the Latvians near the end, weren't allowed to chop down a tree or harm a twig of grass.
Hmm.
And the Germans were well supplied, and the railway system was running, because it was a capital penalty to holler, flee, or run. It was defeatism. And as a result of the Germans forcing the country to operate as if nothing happened until the Russians actually walked in, everything seemed to work, outside of the odd bombing thing that would interrupt the railway for a couple of hours or whatever, for a couple of days. And then basically I figured that's how we got through. It was sort of like thanks to the nasty Gauleiters that made the districts work, the trains run, and so on.
Yeah.
So that was it. You came by boat, which is what a lot of Latvians did. They basically got on the boat and came down the Baltic Sea. And the Russian...
Yeah, and then the Baltic Sea, of course, was patrolled by submarines, so.
But they didn't do much harm, because I think they sank that one
They
big ship,
sank.
the Gustav.
Yeah, there was 2 big boats that history seldom touches. Between Gustav and the other one, there was 9,000 people drowned.
Hmm.
You know, when you compare with Titanic that lost, what, 1,200 or 1,400?
The
Yeah, I
German
remember
fleet
exactly.
operated
It's
quite
responsible.
well in the Baltic, because in October, when took them, they went up around Riga to the Baltic Sea, which is kind of an offshoot of the rush down towards Berlin, the initial rush. They sent the Prince Eugen, the big heavy cruiser, offshore, and they were shooting up the Russian troops. And the interesting thing with the Prince Eugen was, you read history, it wound up in the H-bomb tests in one of the atolls.
Oh, my.
And if you look really closely at Google Earth, and if you know where they towed it and you look at it, you can actually see the thing on the satellite
Sitting-
photos
is
sitting
there?
there in this one atoll. Apparently people still go out to the Pacific and dive. It's outside of the restricted area.
Uh-huh.
Because apparently the ship didn't sink. It actually it survived, so they had to tow it someplace else, and they sunk it. But
Scuttle it.
Hmm.
it basically sat with a bunch of other German ships in the Baltic, and they were able to control that. So they had a couple of Russian submarines, but the Russians couldn't get out of Leningrad at that time because of the
Hmm.
fleet,
Yeah.
the German fleet.
So where did you sail from? You ended up in Toronto, both of you, right?
We
That you sailed from?
Started up from Bremerhaven, which is a port in
Germany, yeah.
Germany, to Halifax, and by train into Canada.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
So Halifax was the
that's right.
Check-in area.
Yeah.
What did you?
I went Cuxhaven, which I guess is the same
Yes,
thing.
yeah.
It's close to Halifax. But it's interesting. My father came over 6 months before, and he went through Genoa. There was another route out, which was the Mediterranean. So I went to Genoa. Stops in Nice, Gibraltar, and Halifax, and then apparently the boat was in the regular circuit from my research, and I went to New York, and then it would go back to Genoa, and so on. So they kind of put us on I guess people went out on existing ships, because we came over
There
in
was not a regular
yeah, we came over in Samaria, which
company that would shuttle them.
which was a Cunard liner, and we were downstairs in the cargo hold with bunks all lined up, and the paying passages were up above, because I remember sleeping in the bunk right next to the hatch, and when it stopped in Le Havre, then they were lowering the freight down right past my bunk.
No.
And the girls, of course, they ended up flying by way of London
Oh, you
and
got-
Canary Islands.
See, I was 11, I was too old to be with the women, and my mother was below the waterline somewhere in the bow. They didn't have any.
No view, huh?
Well, not even the view, I felt kind of damp on this.
Well, your wives, they came in a similar.
The family
Yeah.
came, yeah, well, the family did. The father, our father-in-law, came with my father in the same group.
Yeah,
Oh.
their story is
then
their
the-
story's a little hairier in Latvia than
Yeah,
ours.
yes,
Oh,
yes.
Really?
Theirs is, they really had to run,
Hmm.
and they ended up being flown to Canada.
Yeah.
5 children and a mother.
Oh, wow, that was a big family.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they were in a refugee camp too.
Yes.
And,
There were
Yes.
several hundred refugee camps
Hmm.
scattered all across the western
Actually,
Germany.
they were
Yeah.
in Flensburg, quite close to where the bigwigs capitulated at that time.
Hmm.
Yes,
Dönitz government was nearby,
it's a
apparently.
big shipbuilding port too.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow, a lot of history.
History, yeah. It's too
And,
bad, the military, it's all gone, because those guys are all dead now that served in the forces. There was some,
Well,
the only
we're
one,
getting there.
the
We're
only
getting
one I
there.
know is Vilas. He's sort of married in the family, and he was, what the Germans did was they drafted drafted, literally 14-year-old kids, 15-year-old kids to be what they call aircraft helpers. I don't know what the German name was. And I remember him telling.
He's born 26.
Yeah, but he was too young to be drafted in the regular.
Yeah, so that would
So
make him
26, he'd be, and he's got good stories. He said he was just a kid working on the airfield at the end Czechoslovakia, and he actually saw the German jets go through there.
Okay, the ME-262.
Yeah, well, and he said then when the war was over, they just left him, it was nothing, just he had to leg it out wherever he could, so.
Well, you brought a few of them over here to
Museums.
bisect.
Yeah, there were a few brought over to.
I was kidding earlier, you think about it back, I guess we had the potentially getting bombed by everybody, the Russians, the Germans, the Americans. I don't think the British got far enough over, but potentially they were there.
Yeah, target practice, huh?
And the other one I think
No
I
fun.
liked was, told them about the chaff that was down there. The tinfoil that they used to drop, the tinsels to confuse the radar.
Right.
And we were told in Austria that the Americans were dropping that to kill the cows.
Uh,
So did the younger people want to collect all that stuff?
Well, there's nothing to collect on the tinfoil, but the one thing I remember as a kid was we were warned in Latvia when I was a little kid, do not pick up anything that looks like a shiny thing or something because the Russians are dropping, they'll blow up, they're basically sort of
miniature
little
bombs
or
of some
something.
sort.
Like don't. The other thing that I remember were there were posters that how to deal with a phosphorus bomb or an incendiary bomb, because the fear I think was that the Russians were dropping incendiaries, and that this picture I still remember that you're supposed to put the hook and drag the thing out and whatever. You sort of have weird little recollections of these things.
But as to the country then, though, that there wasn't a lot of damage or.
I don't think there was aircraft damage because the Russians didn't
not
have
because
much
of
an Air
war.
Force, no.
Yeah.
But the damage was done when the collective farm
Collectivization and the deportations and
See, the last huge deportations took place in 1949.
And that was by the Russians.
That was by the Russians,
Yeah.
4 years after the war.
So that they
because-
wanted to form collective farms.
Well, see, the farming community supported the partisans who were ex-soldiers,
Military.
The National Guard people, like Ilga's father was there, and also kulaks, the farmers, owners, they were all deported.
So then they essentially took over all the
Yes,
property.
yes.
I guess these farmers, they owned
Because
their
they
own
would
land?
support the partisans, you see.
Well, and it was general collectivization anyway. My grandfather got to keep the farm building, but he sent me pictures, and he says the beet field that you see is now part of the collective farm. So is the
The
barn,
larger
but-
farm fields were part of it. Smaller ones ended up abandoned. They're now all overgrown.
And
My grandmother's sister and brother both had 40 hectares. That's roughly 100 acres.
100 acres.
The one farm, where you store the grain, was dismantled. The barn was burnt. They totally destroyed the farm. So they're between the two farms.
So they
farms,
wanted to
there's
focus
one barn
everybody
left,
in
and
one.
there was one house on the other one that's left of the two individual farms. Each have about self-sufficient mixed farming. Like two teams of horses, 20 cows, servants, family, and everything. That was all basically destroyed. And instead created 800 collective farms, which are now
Yeah, what's happened after?
Very few of them are still existent. Some of them became cooperatives, but most of them were just totally disbanded.
Well, see, in the '90 when it all
But-
broke up, after that you could go and reclaim land. Like I could go reclaim my grandfather's farm, but I sort of looked at it and, you know, it's going to be difficult to own land where you are and pay taxes, so we let her go. But my wife's,
Well, who takes it over then?
the government basically it went into the new government, became government land, you know, sort of like.
So they'll
they
let
can-
people homestead or something?
Yeah, you could homestead or but our wives' land was reclaimed by our brother-in-law. Like he was the
Yeah.
only male, he reclaimed it, and he kind of had it for a couple of years as an absentee, and one of the relatives farmed it. And he basically turned around and he said, you know, what am I going to do with it in Canada? So we all
Yeah.
family all agreed, and they gave it to one of the relatives.
Hmm.
You know, that
Okay,
was their.
so it's kind of stayed under private
Yeah, it's still
ownership,
private ownership.
and then part of the family somehow down
See,
there.
Latvia, the biggest problem in Latvia is the Russian content, about 30% of them.
They still want to be
Riga, all
Russians.
4 cities are majority are Russians. When you get all the Russian army officers, nobody wanted to retire to their Rodina, Russia.
Hmm.
They all wanted to stay in Jurmala in Riga.
Must
And
be
at
a
one
nice
time
place.
there were 22,000 of them with some dozen generals. They're all living happily after in Riga. And they cause an awful lot of pain when it comes to the language, when it comes to complaining to Moscow, when it comes to complaining to Europe, European Union,
Mhm.
that the Latvians are discriminating against the Russians,
Oh.
which is so much bull.
We're the bad guys now.
We're now the bad guys. The Russians finally learned the term human rights.
Oh, yeah, now
But-
they're
but-
waving the flag, right?
But see the positive end of it. One of the current politicians said, he said they're all getting a pension from Russia, which they have
Yes.
to spend in Latvia. You see,
Oh,
there's
that's
revenue
good.
coming in.
Yeah.
You know.
But the story is, and the worst thing is, that when it comes to the older generation of Canadians, they still think Uncle Joe was a friend,
Yes.
and you can't convince them otherwise.
Hmm. Well, I don't think the
He
U.S.
was an
people
ally.
think about that way.
No.
We were,
The fact that the Russians had 20 million slaves at one time in Siberia.
I used to kid the guys
Cheap labor force.
before they tried to get me to join the Legion in Canada, which I guess is a Veterans Association. I did finally join. And I said, "Listen, it's okay. You guys are okay. I got one problem. It's our allies, the Red Army, that I'm a little concerned about."
yeah. Well, I guess we were more indoctrinated to be anti-communist. The U.S. was very much
Yes,
after the
yes,
war.
Well,
That
I
communism
yeah.
was evil.
Oh, I recall even in the 50s, Hungarian Revolution, when who was the Maurice Rush, the Communist Party was legal in Canada.
Oh yeah.
No, well, we don't share that. That was-
Well, you got McCarthy going
Yeah.
through all that stuff.
Yeah,
oh,
they were looking for communists under every bed, with
Yes.
McCarthy.
Didn't find many, but
So, that's
But
amazing.
it's just the way the public is and today you get 2 versions of history written.
Yeah,
Russians will write their own, Putin will write his own. He says that it was all a huge mistake. This is what he's trying to tell his own people, that with all these murders and massacres and Katina massacre and all that they finally had to admit that it was all a big mistake.
And they haven't carted Lenin statues.
Did they send the orders to the wrong general? Who knows?
yeah.
But the problem is that half the Russian people don't know the difference, and the
Yeah,
other
oh,
half
they're-
tend to believe.
Yeah.
And you can't blame the people for it.
They've been I don't
What-
know,
what they- yeah.
isolated, I
Yes.
guess. The only news they
Yes.
got was
And,
the
and,
propaganda.
and they use the old adage, ignorance is bliss.
Yeah,
Well, then
What you don't
right
know.
now it's getting close to too. You know, there is, you know, I sort of call it still the Iron Curtain's up there. Part of it is the distance and communications. Like Putin, well, government sort of cracked down on non-governmental organizations like NGOs about 3 years ago. So anything that's from the outside, the part of it, they literally have to sort of operate under the radar.
yeah.
And all things, what's the program that Kennedy put in where the young people go out and work in poor countries?
Peace Corps.
Peace Corps, yeah.
Yeah.
Peace Corps was in Russia till right after '90. The Peace Corps went in, and then around '98, I ran into some people from down there that said, well, they've sort of kicked the Peace Corps out, you know. But that's even under Yeltsin.
Mhm.
So they've kind of retreated back into a shell.
Well, they don't seem to want to, they want to
Yeah.
still keep a fence around the
They're
place.
kind of
and,
chauvinistic.
like, this is, yeah.
They really think that they've been badly done by the world and
You know, like Putin said, there was the biggest, saddest day when the wall came down in Berlin.
Oh.
well, the military was cut back too quite a bit. What is
Yeah.
it?
2 million army in Eastern Germany.
Colonel or up, you had to go.
Where did they have to go? And they were the sons of the soldiers.
Of
See,
the
this is the problem,
Germans.
that, where do they go? They have no home to go to.
Yeah.
The same as the many people who were in the army for how many years after the war,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And they all decided that they were where they were. And actually, but it's the old communism that they're still, and particularly when it comes to the old officers,
Yeah.
they can complain bitterly, weekly, send delegations to Moscow and say, look, you got to do something with these Latvians.
Hmm.
Estonians don't have that problem. They're only 1.5 million people, but and they're a little more nationalistic because the Russian percentage is much smaller.
Okay.
Lithuanians, of course, have 3.5 million, and they're 85% Catholic.
Oh.
See, in Riga was also the headquarters of the Baltic Military District. So what happened is they wound up with a lot of the headquarters troops. The commanding
The-
general and staff was
The
there,
ones with money. Yeah.
and also the naval headquarters was there. I was there in '90 before it was breaking up, and the place was just full of people in uniform.
Mm-hmm.
But it was interesting. The sharpest bunch were the Navy guys. They were well dressed and well groomed and everything else. The other people, the officers tended to be more sort of like, like you see some cops that get a little heavy at ponds. They didn't really strike me as soldiers because I think there was a big
Kind
headquarters
of
in there.
relaxed there.
And they had the big antenna there, part of the continental system, the big huge
The
concrete.
locator in Skrunda.
Locator, yeah,
they
Skrunda.
only took it down in '99.
Yeah.
Mm.
The army pulled out in '94 for 4 years after.
That was a big issue. The Russians wanted to keep that, but then they
Well,
finally, when they
What was it for? Was it?
big
transmitter?
early warning
Oh,
antennas.
okay.
They had, I
All
think,
right.
5 or 6 of them only, and they were sort of like long distance. God knows how many stories high.
Latvia has
Yeah.
around 300 sites that are polluted by army leftovers.
Yeah. Well, they were heavy in all kinds of garrisons.
They're all trying to clean them up.
They had some missile bases, not big ones. The airports, the airfields were outside of the boundary. They were just across in the Soviet Union for some reason. Like,
And of course, the big submarine base is now history. But no, when the
Closed.
submarine would come in, they would put fog out. And
Oh.
nobody saw anybody come or go. Just a bit of a
Big
sound.
Big fog.
yeah, and of course when they left, they didn't. Apparently, the stories are they just dumped everything in there. I mean, there's one story. Now I don't know how true it is, but The train stopped at the border of Latvia and Russia with the troops, and they all got out and they cleaned up the cabbages in the field and took that with them. You know?
Took everything that wasn't tied down.
Wasn't tied down and just dumped. Well,
Well,
they've been
they're-
probably dumping. Well, I think this is true for all military. I think all military bases are polluted to some degree.
Yeah.
You don't operate
Well,
by
Too much.
When you consider what happened in the Second World War and what has happened since, not many countries have learned from history.
That's true. We seem to
But
want
what
to keep
Yugoslavia
on
went
fighting.
It's just, and what still goes on.
Yeah.
So will there ever be peace?
I don't know.
Well, we were
We
lucky.
seem-
We made it as kids. My parents
We
made
did,
it. Your
yeah.
parents made it. You know, I had a lot of my buddies my age. They just had mothers when we came, you know, in camp,
Yeah.
and that was interesting.
Well, we've been fortunate here that the wars have not been fought on our territory. And
Yeah.
that's,
And the
It's-
wars have been more sort of, you know, they didn't not well. You had a little bit in the Second World War, I guess, but it wasn't so like a big meat grinder like Europe, where you know what took place between Germans and Russia. I mean, that was just mass
They couldn't-
mass deaths on military on both sides.
yeah.
And
It's,
it's incredible. Well, we've been keeping the tape going fairly long.
I think so.
We don't have to reminisce now. We could go and have a fat tire or something, whatever
Yeah.
that beer is, you know. Poor Dougal, he's gonna be waiting
Well,
for
thank
it.
you very much. for-
Okay,
Thank
well,
you.
thank you. It's a
We gave
part
you
of his.
a little bit of our
Yeah.
side of the story.
Can't tell you much
Yeah.
about the airplanes. We just saw them way up
The
there
little
with a vapor trail
vapor
even, you know,
trails,
and
yeah.
then the
I know,
vibrations
well,
from the
it's-
bombs, but that's about it.
We're more interested in the people.
The
really,
only,
see
there's
the
only
years.
one Latvian airplane inventor, his name is Ackerman,
Ah, don't know.
turn of this century ago,
Hmm,
if you read in aviation history someplace.
okay.
No, he was just an engineer. He worked for Canadair.
Oh,
Yeah, he was flying.
Yeah.
And of course, the only 2-3 arrows that we built in Malton, they were all destroyed. The one didn't get away.
I got a little model though. I got a little model of an aero aircraft. It's the same thing, that trainer down there. I think it's a Harvard, but it's what is it? It's made in Texas or something. Looks to me we call them a Harvard in Canada.
yeah, well,
Uh,
let's see, that's, they call it the Texan.
Something like that.
Yeah, it was a trainer, and now I'm getting a blank as to who built it.
They said it was 4,000 under license, but I remember seeing those things around, and there's still people that have them for recreational purposes
Yeah,
up there.
there are quite a few of them have
And
been
they're
restored
very
in this
in
country.
Canada, it's bright yellow, and I looked at that thing and I
It has
said,
the
it's not
fewest-
yellow, but it looks like a Harvard. you know.
Yeah.
That's because it has the fewest moving parts.
Well, they,
Only one propeller.
yeah, that was a big trainer. It was, the real first aircraft with a lot of power, a lot of heavy airplane that the U.S. Trained with. So it was called the T-6, I guess, at that time. And there were a lot of them built.
Yeah,
I
no,
guess
we-
it was North American, if I remember right, which means.
We still kept seeing, I think I kept seeing them till a few, 10 years, 15 years ago.
Oh, yeah,
These
there's
air
still
shows.
some flying. You go to air shows, you'll see
Yeah,
them.
yeah.
Yeah.
We had Abbotsford Air Show, that's quite big.
The
Yeah.
other one,
Everybody
like
got
down
it.
there, was been used in BC for forest fire.
Oh, yeah, the firefighter.
The PBY was,
No, it was inside. It was a twin engine. It was on the Pacific side, wasn't it?
the one with the
Plane?
high wing?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's the Catalina,
Yeah,
PB4Y.
No, this
Yeah.
wasn't a flying boat. This was a ground aircraft, and it's
Well,
down
we
in the
have-
naval section, right in the corner there. It had been used in BC for forest fighting.
Oh, the B-26?
no.
Oh.
I'm trying to think of it. It's a bomber, but it wasn't. It was a water bomber in BC, and then they acquired it.
Yeah, they sent two over to Europe where to fight fires, the big ones.
And it's in the hangar, or?
It's
in there.
inside.
I just read in the. It arrived here in 1985.
Okay, before my time here.
Oh.
And it had been around. That plane had been around. It had been in regular service.
Well,
the forces.
Well,
and
the
private.
PBY, which
And
is.
it was used only in fresh water.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure. The PBY, that was a water bomber up in Canada, and when it came here,
That floated.
it was a bright green and orange paint job.
So you could see it.
Not military.
I'm not sure. I think the Canadians during the war flew them.
Oh, yeah.
I know I had a client who was an engineer, and he mentioned that that's what he flew during the Second World War.
There were a lot of them
The
made.
mosquitoes, the mosquitoes were sent over.
Yeah.
They were popular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think that one was a plywood
Yep.
made.
That's
we
correct.
had the near where we are. We had the Avro plant, and they originally in Malton, and they originally made I think the Lancasters and
Oh,
and
under
some
license.
of them unlicensed during the war. And then it was interesting. Eventually, they made the Arrow, which at that time was good or better than anything the Americans had. Was a Delta Wing fighter, but it turned out to be too expensive, and it was canceled in '59. And then they wound up making. They made wings for Douglas all these years, for
Yeah.
DC-8s and,
Yeah.
and tails, and
And I think some of the
I had a lot of dealings with the people down there, and these were all aircraft workers from the wartime
and
initially.
some of them ended up as bombardier.
Yeah, the Havilland was up there too, and I remember
Havilland,
guys
yeah.
telling us, one guy I was working with, he said he used to make springs for planes by hand for the Havilland, you know. Like, he was in charge of the spring making. He says they made for the doors
It was a,
springs by hand. They didn't come from some factory,
Is
you know,
that
because
right?
you got, you only need so many. So
Wow.
we had a good
that
aircraft
was before
industry around.
the Oak Motor Company wanted to get close to Malton,
Yeah.
and they were redirected to Oakville. Now they built
We had a good aircraft
now they build
industry down there.
Chryslers
Yeah, well,
in Cambridge.
well, Canadair is still going strong.
Yeah, they're in
Yeah.
Montreal, yeah. That's also politics. They got some contracts, and it's the government decides who gets the contracts, and they need votes, so that goes to Montreal.
Well, they settled their differences with Argentina.
I think how it worked in Canada with them getting the Douglas civilian stuff was because they bought American fighter aircraft, and
Yeah,
it's
well,
like,
there's a lot of the military and, well, I should say, a lot of the sales of Boeing and Douglas required that work be done in the countries that they sold the airplane
Yeah,
to.
yeah.
It's a way of, giving reciprocity, I guess, to even out the money going both directions. And there was Yugoslavia wanted to do that. They wanted some airplanes, and what they did for Douglas was they shipped them hams. They didn't have any money, so they shipped canned hams over.
Well, you know, the immigration part was very interesting too, because I had to deal with quite a few of the people from there through credit unions, and what they did actually in Malton was when something would sort of pick up to do aircraft, they'd go to England, because in the 40s and 50s the industry was receding, and they would literally bring over 4,000 or 5,000 people who were experienced workers, and then they would be working away building the stuff, and then when the contracts ran out, they were just kind of let go, and then when they needed more, and finally the well ran dry after a while, so they had to basically rely on locally produced stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But we wound up with this is where they really brought in skilled labor into Canada. Some really skilled people from England that learned their trade with Vickers and
Yeah,
who knows.
then they end up staying in Canada.
They stayed up in Canada,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, yeah, it was that time, it was in the 50s, it was a lot better to come to Canada and be in the aircraft business than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And they did some, originally I think they built the CF-100 and the Aero, and the problem too is they had a jet liner back in the late 50s, and that was canceled. Then they got into that, and a lot of the good research stuff wound up actually in the space project. Like when the Aero was canceled, they were doing so well in metallurgy and stuff like that that there were a number of people who wound up in Huntsville, Alabama, down in the actually on the moon project, which
Yeah.
were the that had worked, the engineers and the PhDs.
Mhm.
So so you guys in the States again got immigrants from Canada.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Well, I want to thank you both for sharing your experience with us. It's been a real learning experience for me because somehow our history
Well-
doesn't cover that part of the world very well, I guess, unless you
And
really dig into it.
There's so many different stories.
See,
Oh,
I keep telling you, America's big enough to have its own history. So,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, we got 8,000 books here that tell about the different stories,
Yes,
so
yes.
it involved everybody in one way or another during World War II, anyhow.
Does this show up on when you do research? They come in for these here, or like
yeah,
no, for
they
the
can.
books and that as a library.
Oh, yes. If you remember, you can check it out, but we're available to, for anybody to look at those books.
Yeah.
It is a bit unique because most museums take their data and they put it away in a place that's
Well,
secure and they don't let anybody see it. So.
Yeah. See, professional historians, I guess they know how to work, how the system works and that, and they get the access.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think we're doing is that a lot of these stories are disappearing out of local libraries because they just can't keep everything, and they're surplus, and pretty much they're all lost, but we're ending up with a lot of those that are
even the
very
videos,
rare.
the collections that are in there, the films and that.
Yeah, so it's a good repository, and will be more valuable as years go on when people want to.
Then maybe 100 years from now, we'll really find out what happened.
Yeah.
See, your view's colored, your view's colored. We're, even though we were kids that coming through there, we're sort of are a little bit colored on what we read. Depends on the source, and also by what our parents and our associates have told us. So,
Yeah.
So the real history, maybe it's somewhere in between all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But your personal stories, those are correct.
Well, it's a mosaic, and you fit the whole thing through,
Right.
and it's too bad. I was sort of also concerned with our people. We never sort of